This is the original U.S. Treasury check for $7.2 million. Signed in 1867, it finalized a transaction that added over 500,000 square miles to the United States. At the time, critics saw this as an extravagant waste of taxpayer money. The press mocked Secretary of State William Seward for buying an icebox, assuming he had spent millions on a frozen wasteland. But to understand the purchase, we have to look at the seller. In the mid-1860s, the Russian Empire was desperate to offload its only North American colony. Instead of the empty wilderness the Americans imagined, Alaska was a diverse landscape governed by established indigenous nations. The Unangoks, Sugpiaq, Tlingit, and Athabaskan peoples had spent millennia managing complex trade protocols and social structures. Russian frontiersmen, the Promyshlenniki, began an eastward invasion in the 1740s for one reason. They were pursuing sea otters, whose pelts were so valuable in global trade, they were known as soft gold. This initial Russian presence was a private commercial venture, organized around the extraction of high-value resources rather than the long-term goals of a colonial state. By 1799, the Russian-American Company held a state-sponsored monopoly. To keep the pelts flowing, they subjugated the Unangoks and Sugpiaq peoples into a system of forced labor, often taking family members hostage to ensure the hunters complied. Despite their brutality, the Russians were frequently outnumbered. Their hold was so fragile, they often had to pay compensation to native clans for injuries or accidental deaths just to prevent an all-out war. That fragile peace often broke. In 1802, a Tlingit alliance successfully destroyed the primary Russian fort at Sitka, nearly ending the colonial presence entirely. The Russian-American Company relied on a cycle of violence and compensation that was unsustainable, especially as indigenous resistance grew more organized. While the company focused on extraction, a different faction arrived from Russia, the Orthodox Church. Missionaries like Bishop Veniaminov took a distinct path. They learned local languages, developed alphabets to translate indigenous texts, and provided medical assistance that the company ignored. This timeline shows why those medical services became vital. Smallpox and influenza arrived with the Europeans and devastated native communities. By 1840, an estimated half of the entire indigenous population had died. Generations of intermarriage between Russian men and indigenous women created a Creole class, a population that spoke both languages and blended Orthodox and native traditions. This deep cultural integration inadvertently shielded many communities, as the church's influence provided a layer of protection against the company's most violent policies. By the 1850s, the economic engine of the colony had failed. Sea otters were hunted to near extinction, and the Russian-American Company's revenues collapsed. Simultaneously, Russia was defeated by the British and French in the Crimean War. The conflict left the imperial treasury empty, and the empire searching for immediate ways to raise cash. The Tsar also faced a strategic nightmare. He realized that in any future war, the British Navy could easily seize Alaska from neighboring Canada, and Russia lacked the resources to defend it. To salvage some value, Russia turned to the United States. In 1867, Ambassador Stokel negotiated a midnight deal with Secretary of State Seward, reportedly using thousands in bribes to ensure the U.S. Congress approved the appropriation. The Alaska Purchase was a strategic retreat, a fire sale designed to liquidate a failing colony and prevent it from falling into British hands. On October 18, 1867, the Russian flag was lowered at Sitka. The Russian administrators departed, but the indigenous people who had always owned the land remained. The incoming American administration ended the era of cultural syncretism, replacing it with a focused effort to dismantle indigenous life. Under the 1874 Comedy Agreement, Protestant missions carved Alaska into a grid. They implemented strict mandates to erase traditional culture, an English-only policy, the banning of ceremonies, and the suppression of native art and music. Throughout this transition, the original inhabitants were never consulted. The check for $7.2 million represented an imperial transfer of power over a people who had never legally ceded their land. The sale of 1867 liquidated a colonial project that had reached its breaking point. Today, that history is visible in the billions of dollars of extracted resources, the survival of resilient indigenous communities, and the architecture of the church buildings still standing across the Alaskan skyline.